Hey everyone, Professor DG here with a few reflections on Unit 3, Digital Memory. So in the final unit of this course, you're going to be considering something called digital memory. Ultimately, this unit will culminate in your last paper, which will be a persuasive argument essay. So you've already digested the two anchor sources that form the backdrop to this last unit. You've read Ted Chiang's short story, The Truth of Fact, The Truth of Feeling, and you have viewed one of the early Black Mirror episodes from season 1, an episode entitled The Entire History of You. So now that you've had time to digest these two sources, you're ready to start thinking about the Essay 3 prompt. A quick note regarding the source requirements on this final paper. The assignment sheet says that you'll be drawing from at least 3 sources as you construct your argument. Keep in mind you only need 3 sources to get an A in the paper on the paper. In fact, I would prefer that you draw primarily from the short story and the TV episode as you construct your argument. If, however, you find that you need more than one additional source above and beyond those 2 anchor sources to cast your argument in a convincing manner, please feel free to use a 4th source or even a 5th source. But again, your goal here is to focus primarily on the 2 anchor pieces, Chiang's short story and the Black Mirror episode. In terms of that 3rd source, any credible article of your choosing, you can do a simple Google search if you'd like. You can certainly use the library page on your MyTriC space, but basically any credible source of your choosing. So, as you know, this unit explores a technology that's not yet available. Perhaps it may never be available. It's a futuristic technology, basically a device that allows us to record, store, retrieve, and re-experience video footage from any moment of our lives. And that's what makes it different from technology. If you think about the technology available today, there are certainly precursors of this futuristic technology. You could think about the various story features on today's social media site. Those are a kind of life log. You might even think about the body cams worn by many law enforcement agencies throughout the country. Those too are capturing moment by moment footage. Even a simple cell phone recording of a concert you attend might give you a sense of this digital memory, right? Those are all digital recordings after all. But in the Black Mirror episode and Ted Chiang's short story, this technology is taken much further. It involves capturing and storing one's complete life every second, and to therefore create this very detailed and comprehensive life log. It should be noted that in these futuristic fictional worlds, retrieving such recordings also involves subvocalization, body implants, retinal projectors, so it's far more extensive than, say, a body cam. In the Black Mirror episode, the skull implant takes it even further. It even allows users to play back memories on any TV. And of course, the playback includes enhancement features like zoom and crop. There's an audio enhancement in terms of the quality, lip reading technology. Remem, in the short story, has an element to it that the grain doesn't, and that's that it can be triggered by subvocalization. You don't even have to actually say the words. You can think them. You can think about a memory and it will be displayed. So again, far more sophisticated than our current day technology. So this digital memory device, as you know, is called Remem in Chiang's short story and the grain in the Black Mirror episode. But basically it's the same type of thing. And so you can go ahead and lump them together and see them as one type of futuristic technology. So here's what I'd like you to imagine. Assume that you are on an international committee and you've been tasked with, indeed, given the weighty responsibility of deciding whether or not society should adopt these digital memory devices. Um, and so you're on this committee, and the world's fate is in your hands, in the sense that if you call this wrong, there could be harmful effects. Now, what you want to consider in particular is this. The prompt says to write a persuasive argument in which you defend or criticize this futuristic digital memory device called Remember the Grain. And so basically, you're going to answer this question. Should society develop and embrace the type of digital memory life logs presented in Chang's short story and the Black Mirror episode? More specifically, would technological advances like Remember the Grain prove detrimental or beneficial to our relationships and to society? And you are going to want to address them both. So it strikes me that your central argument could be that adopting the technology would prove detrimental to one, let's say relationships, and beneficial to the other, let's say society at large, in terms of the implications for criminal justice. Ultimately, though, your committee is tasked with yay or nay. So, although your argument can note the detrimental effects to one and the beneficial effects for the other, there needs to be a net decision at play here. Which one outweighs the other? Ultimately, should we adopt it or not? That's So if we think about the Black Mirror episode, of course, the protagonist of that story is Liam Foxwell. I think I had mentioned on your debate prep worksheet this quote. I thought it was a great one. Colt Box has described Liam as, quote, a man coming abruptly apart at the psychological seams. And so, of course, the Black Mirror episode is a very dystopian view of this digital memory. And it paints a picture of just how obsessed we all might be in spending our days viewing redos of the past instead of living in the moment, and allowing those redos to just really feed our anxiety and our paranoia. In a day when many of us already spend large segments on social media, perhaps reviewing our own posts and others' reactions to them, what are the implications here? So if the grain were to become available, would we remain glued to the screen, replaying past moments of our lives over and over and over again? Instead of living in the present, would we, in other words, become like Liam? I suppose you're going to need to grapple with the question of whose responsibility is that? Is it Liam's fault he became so obsessed? Is the fact that some of us could become obsessed with this technology and kind of fall into um, the, the abyss of the past? Um, the, is the fact that some of us might do that enough to put the kibosh on the technology? Um, do we need to consider what percentage of us are likely to fall into this trap? Um, and then again, of course, whose responsibility is it to not let that happen? As someone sitting on this international committee, you're going to have to weigh that. And I think to a large extent, it's going to depend on whether you think there will be a lot of Liams or just a few. Another thing to consider, besides our propensity to live in the past, perhaps our propensity to become obsessed with viewing redos, would be this kind of societal safety versus individual privacy issue. So you saw in the Black Mirror episode, Liam go through a security scan at the airport. He was asked to provide or to release footage of his entire previous week. And so you've got law enforcement viewing every moment of the guy's life from the prior week. If you think about it, when we go to the airport today, we very willingly sacrifice our individual privacy for safety. You know, we go through the body scans, which initially were controversial and now everyone's used to. We allow all our possessions to be searched through. It seems that people in the Black Mirror episode are just kind of accustomed to it, whether it's employers engaging in those searches or TSA. Um, and of course this is a British sitcom, so it's not TSA, but the corollary to TSA, um, is this a reasonable trade-off? Um, this individual privacy that'd be forfeited for collective safety. That's another question to grapple with, besides the potential for abuse. And then also, you want to look at the potential for abuse. Um, the invasion of our private moments, not for good, safety, but for either self-serving reasons or, in the case of Hallam, she endured this violent attack. She had her grain gouged out of her neck um, by, in her words, a millionaire perv, whom Hallam speculated was collecting raw footage of others' intimate romantic moments. Of course, Liam assaults Jonas. He forces him with a shard of glass at his throat to delete all the digital memories of Fee. Now, certainly, Liam had a right to be furious with Jonas. Um, did he violate Jonas's privacy by forcing the man to relinquish his digital memories of the affair? That's a question you're going to need to grapple with. Liam, of course, also forces Fee to show the video footage of her actual act of infidelity. He didn't give her much of a choice. And so, in addition to the trade-off of privacy for safety, you're also, as a member of this committee, going to want to think about the potential for abuse. What would happen if our memories got in the wrong hands? The second anchor piece, of course, is Ted Chiang's short story. And as you know by now, there are two plots. They run simultaneously. And so you're experiencing one and then shifting to the other, shifting back to the one. The first plot, the primary plot, has as its protagonist an older journalist who shares his initial concerns about and then ultimately his appreciation for remem. Through the majority of the short story, the journalist is very much opposed to digital memory and then has a complete change of heart towards the end of the short story. The other plot that's running simultaneous involves a protagonist by the name of Jijingi, who lives in a newly colonized, pre-literate village in Tiveland, West Africa. And so while the journalist in the first plot is contemplating this transition from organic to digital memory, Jijingi is experiencing a transition from oral tradition to literacy, to the written word. And so clearly, Chiang is inviting us to consider the corollaries here. He's asking us to consider ways in which all technology, including writing, it changes our way of knowing, it changes how we think, what we value, even what we regard as truth. And so if we think about the narrator, then again, he very briefly in the opening pages celebrates its profound contribution to justice, right before launching into just a series of pretty serious concerns with the technology. But in that opening segment, very briefly, he says, as a journalist, I have long appreciated the usefulness of life logs for determining the facts of the matter. There is scarcely a legal proceeding, criminal or civil, that doesn't make use of someone's life log, and rightly so. When the public interest is involved, finding out what actually happened is important. Justice is an essential part of the social contract, and you can't have justice until you know the truth. So he acknowledges at the forefront this tremendous boon to justice, right? Gone are the days of wrongful arrests and incarcerations. And so he notes that. Then in most of the pages which follow, he presents this catalog of rather serious concerns with remem. He begins by talking about the ways it is likely to disrupt interpersonal relationships. He says life logs that previously lay all but ignored are now being scrutinized as if they were crime scenes, thickly strewn with evidence for use in domestic squabbles. So he's worried that we'll all resort to kind of these fact-checking measures on matters that are entirely trivial, and that this propensity to constantly fact check our partners will erode the relationship, which will no longer be built on trust. There'll be kind of a defensive posturing all the time. His other concern is that he says by fixing every detail of an insult in indelible video, it could prevent the softening that's needed for forgiveness to begin. So not only does he think we'll become kind of nitpicky fact checkers with our partners, but he thinks that because we would have video footage of all the worst things that our partner had ever said or done to us, that we would be inclined to rewatch these, and that it would keep the wound fresh and therefore seriously interfere with our ability to forgive each other. That there's a certain amount of forgetting that's the foundation of forgiving. The third and fourth bullet points are related. He says, it seems to me that if, or that continuous video of my entire childhood would be full of facts, but devoid of feeling, simply because cameras couldn't capture the emotional dimensions of events. And of course, he shares that that scene from his childhood in which he's in the living room playing with cars on the carpet, his grandmother off to the side, sewing. She looks at him with such a look of love in her eyes, and it's one of his most memorable childhood moments. Just the way he felt in that room, being adored by his grandmother, feeling safe in her presence, feeling her genuine love, is a cherished memory. And yet he's acknowledging that there is a subjective lens that he's imposed upon that event. He framed it in a way that made it an endearing memory. And he's worried that if memories no longer had that subjective lens, if they were just raw video footage, that much would be lost. That the emotional dimension of our memories would be lost. They would just be these, stale rolls of video footage, so to speak. The fourth bullet point is another quote in which the narrator asks, what would happen to our sense of selves? It seems to me that a perfect memory couldn't be a narrative any more than unedited security cam footage could be a feature film. So he's not just here mourning the potential loss of a subjective lens, our ability to romanticize memories, but he's also mourning the potential loss of individuality. He says that if two people share a moment in time, they nonetheless have different memories of it because we each impose our own interpretive lens on that moment. And so he feels that organic memory is part of what makes us individuals. And he fears that digital memory would erode at that individuality. So, with all these very serious concerns that he's presented, it becomes kind of shocking when he does an about face and shifts his position entirely. But before we get to that, it's important to note the connection between Jijingi's movement from oral to written ways of knowing and the narrator's concerns with remem. So he says we don't normally think of it as such, but writing is a technology, which means that a literate person is someone whose thought processes are technologically mediated. We became cognitive cyborgs as soon as we became fluent readers, and the consequences of that were profound. Before a culture adopts the use of writing, when its knowledge is transmitted exclusively through oral means, he says it can very easily revise its history. It's not intentional, but it is inevitable. Right now, each of us is in a private oral culture. We rewrite our pasts to suit our needs and support the story we tell about ourselves. With our memories, we're all guilty of a Whig interpretation of our personal histories, seeing our former selves as steps toward our glorious present selves. And so it's an interesting corollary. He's suggesting that we impose a narrative on the past, that we, history is written by the victors, right? Collectively, but in this sense, we're the ones thinking about the memory, and so we're writing the history of it. And it may or may not be as it happened, but we're remembering it in a way that we need to remember it. And he's suggesting that therein lies the strong connection between that transition from oral to written culture and the transition from organic to digital memory. That connection being this transition away from the subjective to the objective. So, what are we to make of the final scenes? I say scenes because, of course, there's two plots in the short story. Well, in the overarching plot, the final scene involves the narrator's discovery of a false memory. And it's a pivotal memory in his life. And he, of course, through use of life logs, discovers that he remembered it entirely wrong in a profound way. In fact, his sense of his relationship with his daughter is completely inaccurate. And so it's the fallible nature of organic memory that makes him change his mind, that makes him embrace digital memory. And he sees it as a means by which we might all be humbled, that we might come face to face with the fallibility, the imperfection of our memories, and the imperfection of ourselves, right? Because our memories are wrong when we unintentionally or intentionally rewrite history to make ourselves look better. And so when we're forced to face the digital record, the sterile, raw video footage, we can't deceive ourselves anymore. We're humbled by whatever imperfections we were trying to erase in our past. And he ultimately argues that this humbling effect that digital memory creates is an inherent good. And so that's, of course, what causes him to shift his position. It's interesting that Jijingi decides to shun vogue truth and embrace his ancestors' respect for Mimi truth. So you'll recall that in Tiv culture, there's two words for truth. There's Vo, which is what actually happened, and there's Mimi, which is the right thing. And you're thinking as the reader, now wait, how are they different? How is what actually happened as a truth different than the right thing, different than Mimi? Perhaps we can best think about this by returning to the Black Mirror episode. And of course, this Vogue versus Mimi truth is what the title of the short story is getting at, right? The truth of fact, that would be Vogue. The truth of feeling, that would be Mimi. And so let me ask you this. What matters more in the Black Mirror episode? The Vogue truth, the truth of fact, is that Fee cheated on Liam 18 months ago. She had an affair with Jonas. That's the fact. That's the Vogue fact. And in fact, the young girl whom Liam thinks is his biological daughter may not in fact be. Paternity tests still needs to be conducted, I would guess. The end of the Black Mirror episode is kind of ambiguous about whether it turns out she is or isn't his daughter. The entire ending of the Black Mirror episode is ambiguous, right? I mean, did Liam leave Fee? He removes his grain so he can no longer re-experience the pain of her infidelity. Did he do that so that he could stay? Because he needed to forget? Or does that footage where he's walking around the house at the end and she's gone suggest that they've broken up? You might be able to cast a theory either way. But the truth of the fact is, she cheated on him 18 months ago, right? That's the Vogue truth. The Mimi truth is she wanted to be with him. She messed up. She planned to never tell him because she wanted to stay in the relationship. She chose to be with Liam. She actually loved Liam. She didn't leave him for Jonas. And so the Mimi truth is she wanted to be with Liam. So which is more important? The truth of fact or the truth of feeling? I mean, if Liam never found out, if his worst fears were never realized, would he have gotten over it and the two of them been happy or not? That's a question that we, the viewer, are left to grapple with. Chang has observed that literacy, in other words, writing, encourages a culture to place more value on documentation, that would be truth of the fact, and less on subjective experience, that would be truth of feeling or mimi. And so I think what you need to grapple with is whether you believe digital memory, like the written word, does in fact place more value on Vogue truth than mimi truth. It's raw video footage, so one could certainly argue that it's objective. It doesn't have that subjective lens, right? So if digital memory is more like the truth of fact, what would happen if we began relying on digital memory instead of organic memory? What would be the implications of this shift? In the same way that writing values documentation over subjective experience, if we're to assume that digital memory also values documentation over subjective experience, what would be the implications of that shift? Something also to consider. In terms of other implications, other potential good, we've already noted the potential good in terms of criminal justice, in terms of security. Another potential good, perhaps, is that digital memory could disrupt the efforts of those who spread disinformation. This could have profound effects on media, right? This is such a compelling quote by Kevin Kelly of Wired Magazine. Kevin says, truth is no longer dictated by authorities, but it's networked by peers. For every fact, there's a counterfact. And all those counterfacts and facts look identical online, which is confusing to most people. So I myself am wondering, as I consider this potential digital memory, if it is developed, will digital memory clarify the truth? Will it help us cut through the layers of misinformation that permeate modern society? I don't know. And then back to the earlier point, if it does, are there truths that can't be captured with Vo, but need to be embraced as Mimi? Final thought. You're sitting here wondering, these are just fictional stories, Lori, right? This is all just sci-fi stuff here. You probably know this already, but Elon Musk did develop a company called Neuralink Corporation a few years back. He's working on neurotechnology that involves implantable brain-computer interfaces. So are these fictional stories? Well, these interfaces aren't a reality today, but here's a company with a lot of funding behind it that's geared towards making it a reality. The University of Toronto is doing something interesting with something called hippocamera, relating to the hippocampus of the brain. And it's created this, the University of Toronto has, for people suffering from Alzheimer's. It's actually just a phone app. And it walks people with Alzheimer's through how to videotape moments they want to remember, but then it also walks them through this whole sequence that's geared to train their brains. So it has them label the memories a certain way. The app prompts them to watch the memory at certain times during a day and doing certain things while they're watching it so that the hippocampus is more likely to be activated. So even though it's not a direct link to the hippocampus, it's based on the science behind how the hippocampus functions. And it just struck me as possibly one more step towards remem in the grain. So this is, of course, the beauty of science fiction. I'll leave you with this thought by Ray Bradbury, one of the great science fiction writers. Bradbury says science fiction is the most important literature in the history of the world because it's the history of ideas, the history of our civilization birthing itself. Science fiction is central to everything we've ever done. And I think it also allows us to grapple with the ethical implications of developments before they occur and to kind of work through those implications in a way that allows us to be more thoughtful about the eventual adoption of new technologies. So that is a wrap in terms of, I said these would be a few thoughts on the two anchor pieces, but hopefully that was helpful to you as you're considering them. Remember, ultimately the decision is yours. In the debate prep worksheet, you're playing a particular character. You're espousing the view and perspective of a particular fictional character as you consider the question about whether digital memory would be beneficial or detrimental to individuals and society. But in your essay, you're going to be arguing as yourself, assuming that you have the power to make this call. What call would you make? Do we adopt it or do we not adopt it? That's a wrap for now.